conflict is inevitable. Combat is optional. That's a quote from Max Lucado. He's a minister who shares our heritage in the Church of Christ. And that's something that I share when I do premarital counseling with couples who are engaged and getting ready to be married. Sometimes there's this assumption that we have that once we find the right person, everything's just going to click and it's going to be nice and easy all the time. Or maybe the assumption is once we find the right church, everything will just be easy and we'll never have any problems. Or once we find the right job, everything will just make sense. But the reality is, even in the best relationships, in the best churches, in the best jobs, there's still conflict. And we need to learn how to deal with that in a healthy way. We just started this series on Koinonia, the New Testament's word for fellowship. And last week we talked about how Koinonia refers to close relationships among people that are built on mutual interest. It refers also to the attitude of goodwill that exists in those relationships, meaning you have people in relationship with one another. Not only do they love each other, but they actually like each other as well. There's some good feelings there. And also, Koinonia fellowship involves joint participation in a common cause, which means you are locked. You're locked in. Sorry, I can't talk right now. I guess you have a shared purpose, a shared mission. You're walking side by side with people, and you've got a goal in common with them that you're both working on together. And guys, it is so powerful when a congregation lives this way. It is so powerful when a congregation has this kind of fellowship. Last week, we were reading Acts chapter 2 as our scripture reading. And it talks about how the church was devoted to these kinds of things. They devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and to fellowship, to the breaking of bread, and to prayer. It also talks in that passage about how they were devoted to worship, they were practicing hospitality, they were living generously and loving one another sacrificially. And the result of all of that, of a unified church living out their mission, was that the Lord was adding to their number daily those who were being saved. Guys, we have an enemy. And our enemy is the devil, and the devil knows how powerful it is when the church is unified and pursuing its mission together. So, of course, one of Satan's primary tactics is going to try and cause division among God's people. Satan does not have the power to defeat the church, but he does have the power to divide us if we let him. And so as Christians, if we really want to promote and pursue koinonia fellowship in the church, we need to be on guard against the devil's attacks, against these kinds of temptations to turn against one another. It would be awesome, it would be fantastic even if the church never had any kinds of problems, never had any kinds of conflict, but that's not realistic. Anytime two or more people spend any amount of time together, there is going to be conflict. That's true even in the healthiest teams, healthiest marriages. Like I said, even the best churches have this kind of conflict. So the key to a healthy relationship, the key to a healthy church, is learning how to handle conflict well. And that's why today's message is called Responding to Conflict. The main idea that we'll be exploring is the fact that koinonia fellowship, which we've been talking about, requires us to resolve our conflicts in a Christ-like way. And there's two parts to that statement, right? Koinonia fellowship requires us to resolve our conflicts. There are a lot of people who are so nervous or apprehensive about any kind of conflict that they would actually rather run completely the opposite way and avoid it forever. All right, so real fellowship, though, requires us to actually resolve those conflicts, not avoid them. But it also requires us to do that in a Christ-like way. I've seen plenty of churches sweep issues under the rug. They're not willing to resolve the conflicts. But I've also seen instances where conflict erupts out into the open and it turns into hostility and animosity and gossip and all kinds of things that completely contradict the teachings of Jesus and the values that he wants us to live by. So if we want to have real, genuine koinonia fellowship in the church, we have to learn how to resolve our conflicts, and we have to learn how to do it in a way that honors Jesus and that aligns with the values of his kingdom. So for today's message, here's what we're going to do. We're going to start in Romans chapter 12, Because in Romans 12, 16 through 21, Paul gives us some great principles that we can apply to our one another relationships in the church, in our families, in our neighborhoods. Great principles to apply in our relationships. And then what we're going to do is we're going to look at a specific conflict that Paul was writing about in the book of Philippians. In the book of Philippians chapter 4, Paul mentions two individuals in that congregation, and he actually mentions them by name. And he talks about how they're in conflict with one another, and he's trying to help them resolve that conflict. So we're going to look at a specific instance of conflict in the Bible, and then at the end, we'll do some practical application and say, all right, the next time that we're in a tough situation with someone, and there's tension in that relationship, or there's conflict in the church, what are we going to do about it? How can we apply these principles that we've talked about to our own walk with God and our own relationships in the church? All right, so we're going to start in Romans chapter 12, verses 16 through 21. Paul gives us some great teaching on our one another relationships. Here's what the Bible says. Live in harmony with one another. Do not be proud, but be willing to associate with people of low position. Do not be conceited. Do not repay anyone evil for evil. Be careful to do what is right in the eyes of everyone. If it is possible, as far as it depends on you, live at peace with everyone. Do not take revenge, my dear friends, but leave room for God's wrath. For it is written, and here Paul is quoting from the Old Testament scriptures, "It is mine to avenge. I will repay, says the Lord." On the contrary, if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he is thirsty, give him something to drink. In doing this, you will heap burning coals on his head. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. Like I said, Paul is giving us some general principles to apply to our relationship. And the goal that he identifies is for all of us to live at peace with everyone. We heard that in verse 16 where he says, live in harmony with one another. I looked that phrase up. He literally says, be of the same mind as one another. Have the same mindset. And then we also heard it in verse 18 where he says, live at peace with everyone. That's the goal that we're striving for. Now in verse 18, there are some important caveats there because he says, if it is possible, live at peace with everyone. And he also says, if it is possible, as far as it depends on you, live at peace with everyone. That's an important reminder that sometimes there will be people in your life who are committed to staying in conflict with you. And it really doesn't matter how much you try and resolve the conflict. Sometimes there will be people who are entrenched in their bad attitude towards you and their animosity towards you. And the Bible is reminding us that we can't force someone to be at peace with us, but we still have to do everything within our power to be at peace with them. And that's the goal that we're striving for, to live in harmony, to live at peace with everyone. And that is a really lofty and challenging goal that Paul is giving us as a church. At the same time, Paul is a realist, and he knows that sometimes we're not going to be at peace with one another. Sometimes it's going to feel impossible to be in harmony with other people. And besides, Paul himself had plenty of conflicts with other people in the Bible. Paul certainly had conflicts with the Roman Empire. They ended up throwing him in prison because they didn't like what he was doing. Paul had a lot of conflict with the Jewish authorities, the Jewish people who felt like Paul's preaching went against the Old Testament scriptures. They were ready to flog him and beat him and kill him. Paul even had conflict with other Christians, people who shared his deep conviction that Jesus was the Son of God who died for the sins of the world. Paul had conflict with people who shared the most important thing in common with him. So, Paul, knowing how common it is for people who love God to end up in conflict with one another, gives us some important principles to apply when that peace has been compromised. So in between these statements of live in harmony and live at peace, he tells us, actually a little bit later in the chapter, don't repay evil for evil. So if someone does something messed up towards you, don't turn around and do something messed up towards them just to get even. They did it first is not a Christian ethic. Or they did the worst thing to me, so I'm going to do something back at them so they know that's not a Christian ethic. Don't repay evil for evil. Don't seek revenge. Paul actually tells us to love our enemies. If they're hungry, feed them. If they're thirsty, give them something to drink. And not just love them as like an attitude that we have in our hearts, but he's actually teaching us to serve them, to do something tangible, to be a blessing in their life. And at the very end, I love this part. I love that he includes this. He says, overcome evil with good. Don't let the evil overcome you, but overcome evil with good. He's not telling us to roll over, to be a doormat, to let evil people do whatever they want and just accept that. He's actually telling us we need to overcome evil in our lives. We need to stand up for what is good and right and true. We need to have those conflicts, engage in those battles. It's just that we need to do it in a way that's completely different than the way that the world fights their battles and engages in their arguments. We have to learn how to engage in conflict differently so that evil doesn't win the day, but we don't end up practicing evil in our own lives as we go about those conflicts. So we have to learn to engage those conflicts differently than the world around us. When we were in California, we had a seminar that was all about conflict. And what I learned is that everyone kind of has their own personal approach to how they like to deal with problems or to resolve problems. We ended up taking an assessment, everyone who participated in this conference, and it was like an either-or question. When this situation happens, would you rather do this or would you rather do that? And it kind of spit out this personality profile for each person and described the way that we like to go about handling our conflicts. And you can kind of graph people. You can kind of put it on a graph like this. What they measured was some people are more assertive than others when it comes to dealing with conflict. Some people are really active and bold. They'll tell you exactly what they think. They're working really hard to resolve that conflict. Other people are a little bit more passive. At the same time, some people are really cooperative. They're working really hard to understand the other person's needs. They want to find the solution to the problem. They're really cooperative. They're trying to help it come to a resolution. And some people, not so much. Meaning they're really not interested in solving the problem at all. And when you kind of graph those two things, people can end up in all of these different quadrants. The competing people are very assertive. It's just that they're not cooperative at all. So if there's a problem, they're going to be really vocal, really aggressive, but they're approaching the conflict as if there's going to be one winner and one loser, and they're not about to be the loser here, guys. So they are going to go to battle and go to war in order to solve that conflict. So you can hear that's really assertive, but it's not that cooperative. Then there's the people who avoid conflict like it's the plague. They're not assertive at all. They're not going to cause any problems, but they're also not going to cooperate in helping to solve the problem because they are literally running away from that problem and they want to avoid it. They want to go hide. Can we please just talk about this later? That's the mantra of the conflict avoiders. Accommodators are people who they're not assertive at all, but they are very cooperative, meaning if there's a conflict, I really want to get tacos for dinner. I really want to get pizza for dinner. The accommodator will say, oh, it's okay. We don't have to do it my way. Let's just do it the way you want to do it. And they say that over and over and over and over. Let's just do it your way. Fine. I don't want to fight about this. Let's just do it your way. That can feel like the right thing to do until you realize that you're not giving that other person a chance to hear you out. You're not giving them a chance to love you and to serve you. It's not really an equal kind of thing. You're just constantly surrendering and letting the other person get their way. Then there's collaborating, which is you're working really hard together so that both people get exactly what they're hoping for, a solution that everyone's happy with. And then the compromisers are just somewhere in the middle there. And so the reason I'm bringing this up is because it can feel really challenging to know the right way to handle all the different conflicts that we experience in our relationships, in our marriage, in our families, in our church. And there's not like one right way to solve every problem. It actually takes a lot of wisdom to know which one is going to honor God and honor that other person because the situations can feel so different. For example, we've got a safety team here at Southwest. I don't know if you guys know that. We have a safety team. And unfortunately, you can no longer take it for granted that when large groups of people gather together, that they're automatically going to be safe. We have a team here that's dedicated to protecting our church family, and I love that. If there was someone who showed up at Southwest with really bad intentions and they wanted to harm people. And then our safety team was able to meet them at the door. They're in conflict because one of them wants to harm the church and our safety team wants to protect the church. I don't want our safety team to be accommodators in that moment and say, oh, it's okay. Let's do it your way. And I really don't even want them to compromise and say, okay, you want to harm the church, we want to protect the church. Why don't you just harm the left side of the auditorium and leave these people alone? That situation doesn't call for that kind of... I want them to be competitors and say, absolutely not. You are not getting inside. This is the family of God, and we will protect them at all costs. That's the kind of approach that we need in that situation. But imagine how harmful it would be if you had a deep issue, a problem in your life, maybe even a concern, and you brought it to the church, and the ministers or the elders heard that, and they went to battle with you. And if they approached that the same way the safety team was approaching, like a threat to the church, if they went to war against you because you brought up an issue or some constructive criticism or some feedback, see, that's the completely wrong approach in that situation. It takes so much wisdom for us to know the right way to approach these problems. It's important for us to handle them, but to do it in a Christ-like way. By the way, if you're wondering where I landed on this, I am a big-time conflict avoider, and I was something like the 99th percentile for avoiding conflict. And if you're sitting there thinking, Bryan, that's not good. Like, you are a minister in the church. You need to be more like active in having those tough conversations. It's not good for you to stay back on. You know what? I agree with you. And I am ready to like turn over a new leaf right here, guys. I'm a big commitment right here. I'm going to set aside 3 days at the end of this month for open office hours. And if any of you has any problems or grievances or issues with me or my ministry, come on down all day long. It'll be February 29th, 30th, and 31st. You can come on in. Anything you want to talk about those days, I will be here for you. So just put that on your calendar. And that's what conflict avoiders do, right? They choose imaginary dates and they say, let's just push it off till then. The principle Paul gives us in Romans 12. Okay, live at peace with everyone. Love and serve your enemies. Overcome evil with good. There's a specific conflict in Philippians 4 that Paul writes about. We were in Philippians last week just talking about how fellowship involves a shared purpose. We've got a mission that we're all pursuing together, as well as shared experience of God's grace. And in that church, even though they had the same purpose, even though they'd all been saved by the grace of God, there was still conflict. And Paul talks about this. He even mentions the two women who are at the center of this conflict by name, which is pretty rare for Paul to single anyone out in his letters. He mentions them by name because this is serious. So this is what he's talking about. It's Philippians chapter 4. I'll be reading verses 2 through 3. He says, I plead with Euodia, that's one of the women, and I plead with Syntyche, the other woman who's at the center of this conflict, to be of the same mind in the Lord. And that is actually the same phrase that Paul uses in Romans 12 when he says, live in harmony with one another. It's the same exact phrase. I plead with them to live in harmony in the Lord, to be of the same mind in the Lord. Yes, and I ask you, my true companion, help these women, since they have contended at my side in the cause of the gospel, along with Clement and the rest of my co-workers, whose names are in the book of life. He's calling these two women out by name, and he's saying, I want you guys to be of the same mind again, to live in harmony again. And he does say the same mind in the Lord. He's not expecting them to be a copy and paste identical version of one another in all things, but despite their differences, they still need to develop the capacity to be of the same mind in the Lord when it comes to loving God and loving others and making disciples. That they need to be able to see eye to eye when it comes to the big things like that. So let me illustrate what's happening here in the congregation. There's two women. And they seem to be influential in some way. They seem to be good workers for the cause of Christ, hard workers, two women who love God. But they're in conflict with one another. So Paul is writing to a true companion, and we don't know exactly who that is specifically. But he's calling on someone there to step up to be a mediator in this conflict. Now, Paul does seem to make it really clear that both of these women love God. And both of these women have worked diligently for the cause of the gospel. It's not like the reason they're fighting is that one of them loves God and the other doesn't, or one of them has read their Bible and studied it a lot and the other hasn't, or one of them has pure motives and the other has really bad, ulterior, impure motives or something like that. And I think sometimes in the church there can be a tendency, if we don't really check our hearts and our attitudes, that when we're in conflict with one another, that sometimes we explain that conflict by saying, well, it's obvious I love God and they don't love God as much. Or I'm taking the Bible seriously and they're not. Or I've got good motives, I'm just not sure about theirs. And sometimes we explain those conflicts in a pretty uncharitable way. In my experience, most of the conflict that I see in the church cannot be explained by saying one of them loves God and the other doesn't. One of them takes the Bible seriously and the other doesn't. It's just hard to explain the differences. It generally has to do with the fact that there are multiple people who love God sincerely and are reading the Bible and they're taking it seriously and they're devoted to pursuing the gospel mission, but they still end up disagreeing about something. And that seems to be the situation here. Two women who love God and have dedicated their lives to advancing the gospel, they are nevertheless in conflict with one another. So what Paul does is he calls upon this mediator to step up, and he pleads with each woman to live in harmony in the Lord, to be of the same mind. And he used that word plead, which is a really strong word, like to urge, to exhort, to beg. It is a word that it almost implies a sense of desperation. This is what people would do in the Gospels. They would come to Jesus if they were sick or if their family member was ill or if they were paralyzed or they were blind. They would come to Jesus and they would beg him to bring healing because they knew he was the only one that could heal them, that could make a difference in their lives. Do you guys remember Jairus, the synagogue leader? His daughter was on her deathbed, essentially. He comes to Jesus and begs and pleads for Jesus to heal her. This is a word, it's intense, isn't it? There's some desperation here. It matters a lot. And so this word is trying to illustrate how important, how dire the situation is. Paul uses this word when he pleads for the church to be unified as one all throughout his letters. And I think one of the most interesting places where this word is used in the New Testament is in the parable of the prodigal son. The younger son, who has been in open rebellion against his father, has been in that faraway country, has wisely made the decision to come back home and ask to be a servant in his father's household. The father ends up throwing him this lavish party, this grand banquet to celebrate the fact that his son was lost and now he's found. And everyone is there celebrating with the father. Everyone except the older son, who doesn't think we ought to be rewarding or celebrating this sinful younger brother. So what does the father do? He goes outside to where that older son is, and he begs and he pleads for his son to come inside and join the celebration. This is a parable about the heart of our Father, and the heart of the Father desires for all of his children to be together around the same table, sharing a fellowship meal, celebrating the fact that a sinner was lost and now they're found. And the Father wants that fellowship, despite the differences that we may experience, despite the hard feelings that we might have with one another. It's the same word in that story that Paul is using here, pleading with the women to live in harmony and be of the same mind. There are plenty of Bible scholars who think that this conflict between Euodia and Syntyche was the primary reason why Paul wrote the book of Philippians. And if it wasn't the main reason, it was right up there as one of the most important reasons why he was writing this letter. That this conflict was so important, Paul needed to address it with a whole letter and to name these people, like mention their names. It was so important for Paul that they worked out their differences because he knew the health of the church was at stake. The gospel mission was at stake. If they couldn't see eye to eye and come together, they weren't going to be effective as a congregation. And so you can look at some of the things that Paul has said in Philippians leading up to chapter 4, and you can read them and go, these things are true and helpful and applicable for all people in all places, across time, across culture. In every situation, these are universally applicable to our lives. But you can also read these and go, this makes a ton of sense if one of Paul's primary goals in writing Philippians is to help a church in conflict come back together in unity and resolve that conflict in a Christ-like way. Because here's some of the things that he talks about in this letter. And just think about this conflict in the church as we talk about these things that Paul has mentioned. He reminds us that first and foremost, we are citizens of heaven in Philippians chapter 3. We don't know what Euodia and Syntyche were in conflict about, but if it had anything to do with basing their identity on groups or teams or the politics of the day, the different organizations or identities of the world, Paul is reminding them we have something that transcends all of the different groups and identity markers of this world. Early in chapter 3, he tells us to forget what is behind and just focus on what is ahead, on the things Christ is calling us to do. In chapter 2, do everything without complaining and arguing. Earlier in chapter 2, he says, look, in your relationships with one another, you need to strive to have the same kind of attitude that Jesus had. And what kind of attitude did Jesus have? Well, he constantly put other people first. He sacrificed himself. He humbled himself so that other people could be blessed. And we need to have that same kind of attitude in our relationships with one another. And in chapter 1, calls upon us to conduct ourselves in a manner worthy of the gospel. So again, you can read all those things and say, man, that's true for everyone, no matter what kind of situation you have in your life. But it's especially true for a church that's in conflict. And so it makes sense to me that this really could be one of the primary reasons that Paul was writing this letter, was to help them resolve this conflict in a Christ-like way. So what about us? What should we try to do whenever we face a tense conversation or when we experience a rift in a relationship, and whether it's in our own family, maybe in a small group that we're in, or maybe it's just something that affects the whole church? What should we do? Well, Jesus gives us a few principles that we can apply when we start to feel that there is a problem, that there is some conflict. One of the things that Jesus teaches us to do is to go to that person directly, right? Matthew chapter 18, if your brother or sister sins, go and point out their fault just between the two of you. If they listen to you, you've won them over. But if they will not listen, take one or two others along so that every matter may be established by the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. If they still refuse to listen, tell it to the church. And if they refuse to listen even to the church, treat them as you would a pagan or a tax collector. So what Jesus is saying is, if someone has sinned against you, talk to them privately. Like, start with that, a one-on-one conversation. Talk to them privately, be direct, and include others only if you're not able to resolve it on your own. That skill, that practice of just going to the person and having a direct conversation, it's so rare in the world that we live in now, because our first instinct is to blast it in front of everyone, maybe put it on social media, maybe talk to everyone in the world except the one person that we have a problem with. I do think, though, that there are some situations where you need to have a different approach to what Jesus is talking about here. Situations of abuse, situations of violence, or if there is a power imbalance. I think just wisdom and practicality calls for a different response there. But in the vast majority of situations, when someone has offended us or sinned against us, Jesus' expectation for you is not that you would go online and blast that person or gossip about them. It's that you would go to that person and have a direct conversation. If you're not able to resolve it on your own, bring in a few trusted Christian friends who can help break the impasse. And if that doesn't work, then involve more people until you're able to reconcile it. Jesus eventually does say if none of that works and that person is entrenched in their sin and is committed to causing problems and has not repented at all, you do not owe it to them to allow them to keep harming you over and over and over if they are committed to causing problems over and over and over. But do your best to solve that. Start small and involve others only if necessary. But what about the opposite? That's if someone has done something against you. What if you're the one that's caused a problem? In Matthew 5, Jesus says, Matthew 5:23, Therefore, if you are offering your gift at the altar and there remember that your brother or sister has something against you, leave your gift there in front of the altar. First, go and be reconciled to them, then come and offer your gift. In both instances, whether someone has sinned against you or you've sinned against someone else, Jesus is calling on us to be intentional about reconciling, intentional about working through that problem so that we can be unified and in fellowship with our brothers and sisters. He doesn't want to let those problems go unaddressed because he knows that is going to compromise the unity and the fellowship of the church, something that we really need if we want to be successful at our gospel mission. So, let me give you some really practical things that you can do if you find yourself needing to have those kinds of conversations. Number one, and this comes from Stephen Covey in his book, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, seek first to understand, then to be understood, which means spend most of your time listening and asking questions and finding out really what happened and why they did it, what their intentions were. A lot of the problems that we experience with other people are built on misunderstandings. And so if we can just approach those conversations with curiosity and questions and try and find out really what happened instead of just jumping to conclusions, that's going to help quite a bit. James 1:19 teaches us to be quick to listen and slow to speak and slow to become angry. Proverbs 18:2 says, "Fools find no pleasure in understanding, but delight in airing their own opinions." In Proverbs 18:13, later in that chapter, "To answer before listening, that is folly and shame." We need to spend time listening and asking questions to really understand. You'll have the opportunity to share your side, I know it, but just spend a little bit of extra time understanding what happened. The next thing is to practice the principle of charity, which is just to start with the best intentions or the best assumptions about that person's intentions and their motivations. Don't assume the worst about someone. I don't know where I heard this quote originally, but I heard it said like, the most exercise some Christians get is jumping to conclusions. So we need to really stop and listen, assume the best about people, understand they're probably a good person who made a mistake. Good people do bad things all the time. The fact that someone did something against you that you didn't like, it doesn't mean that they're a jerk. It could just be they were having a bad day. So just practice the principle of charity. And finally, be a peacemaker, and definitely not a drama starter. Matthew 5:9, Jesus says, "Blessed are the peacemakers." Psalm 34 says to turn from evil, seek peace, and pursue it. And so it's so important for us to not just avoid conflict, but really make a decision to pursue peace. But most importantly, guys, I think this is really the most important thing that we can keep in mind, is when we start to feel those conflicts or those problems bubbling up and rising to the surface, we really need to remember how much Jesus personally sacrificed for the unity of the church. What I mean by that is how much he personally had to go through so that we can live at peace with one another. I'd encourage you to read all of Ephesians chapter 2 to think about that. But verses 13 through 18, to me, drives this point home. And this is where I'll wrap things up. It says, "But now in Christ Jesus, you who were once far away have been brought near by the blood of Christ. For he himself is our peace, who has made the two groups one and has destroyed the barrier, the dividing wall of hostility, by setting aside in his flesh the law with its commands and regulations. His purpose was to create in himself one new humanity out of the two, thus making peace. And in one body to reconcile both of them to God through the cross, by which he put to death their hostility. He came and preached peace to those who were far away and peace to those who were near. For through him we both have access to the Father by one Spirit." It's talking about Jews and Gentiles and their hostility, but it applies to all of us. Anytime we're in conflict with others, we need to stop and remember how much Jesus sacrificed so that we could live at peace with everyone. At this point, we're going to offer our invitation song. Jesus died on the cross so that we can have peace with God and we can have peace with our brothers and sisters in Christ. We are going to have conflict. That's inevitable. What we do from that point is going to determine how much we're honoring God or just imitating the customs and the values of the world. But we're going to offer our invitation song now, which is a chance to dedicate your life to Christ, to talk and pray with our elders and their wives, or really just talk about anything that's going on in your life right now. So go ahead and stand and sing, and if you'd like to talk and pray with our elders, you'll have the opportunity to do that.